one of the prisoners I would encounter very quickly when I was at Wormwood Scrubs was a serial murderer by the name of Dennis Nilsen. So I learned a great deal about serial murder from a serial killer. And the thing I learned most of all was that you could never trust anything a serial killer tells you. I was born in Scotland. My parents were farmers, and we lived very close to a town called Carluke in Lanarkshire. And I had 3 sisters who are older than me. You know, we lost our biological parents when they were quite young. And so the sense of there being a biological template, I talk about this recently. I talked about the fact I was never able to go with my dad for a pint. You know, I never had an experience of having a father that I could go for a drink with. And I just wonder, you know, what would that have been like? It would have been nice to have done that. And I have a son, and who's in his early 30s, and I've been for a pint with him and all that kind of stuff. So, but I do think about the impact of both my sisters and losing our parents when they were young people, you know. So I think that has had quite a bit of an influence on me.
Why did you first become interested in crime? How did it come into your life?
This is what I always call the origin story of my interest in criminology. I would probably have been a junior academic. That was where my career, that was where all my education was funneling me to. I would have just simply become a junior fellow at the college in Cambridge, which was the university I attended. And I played rugby, and I was a winger, and I got fouled very badly by one of the forwards in a match that I was playing. And when we both got up off the ground, because he had so badly fouled me, I was incensed, I was angry, and I turned around and I punched him. And I punched him in the face and broke his nose. And he was sent off for the foul. I was sent off because I retaliated and broken the man's nose. And I just remember 2 hours later, we were drinking in the bar, and he was saying, "Oh, I shouldn't have done that to you." And I was saying, "Oh, no, I shouldn't have punched you." And, you know, it was all fine. We had kind of repaired the damage of the violence that he had used and I had retaliated with. It just so happened that that week, the Cambridge Evening News, which was the local newspaper, covered the story of a young man who was the same age as me, but who didn't go to the university, but was working, he was actually unemployed. I remember it said unemployed labourer in the news story. So he was a labourer in the town, albeit he was unemployed. He got thrown out of a pub or a club, and he turned around and punched the bouncer in the face and broke the bouncer's nose. And I just remember the story was about him being sent to Borstal, which was a form of youth custody. And I wanted to know, how does his violence, which was no different to my violence, how does his violence in that context lead inexorably to jail? And my violence led to me repairing the damage that had been done with the victim of my violence in the college bar. And of course, the answer to that question is class, it's privilege, it's the ability to use one's social capital to transcend the label of offender in relation to what you have done. And I still believe all of that is true. That was what made me want to go, I need to know more about crime. I need to know more about jurisprudence. I need to know more about the law. And as a consequence of that, that sent me on a trajectory that instead of becoming a junior fellow I finished my PhD on the Friday, and on the Monday, having sat and passed the civil service exams, I was the assistant governor under training at Wormwood Scrubs. It was my first ever job.
What was Wormwood Scrubs like at the time that you entered as a governor?
So this is the early 1980s, Wormwood Scrubs. The first thing I remember is that one smelled Wormwood Scrubs before one saw Wormwood Scrubs, and that was because there was no such thing as integral cell sanitation. Prisoners would throw their urine and shit out of windows in what were called shit parcels. So one smelled, especially in the summer, the prison long before one saw the prison. And that was the first thing that I remember. And then the second thing was I thought I had made a terrible mistake. I was like, it's all good and well having these kind of philosophical ideas, but now here's a reality. And what are you going to do with this reality? And what skills do you have to survive in this reality? And Wormwood Scrubs was a tough place. And it was a place where the new assistant governor under training was Dr. Wilson. And so there was a confusion immediately about who I was and what my role might be. And therefore there was a slight distrust, and there was a slight sense in which I was constantly having to prove myself, except I didn't know how to do so because I didn't know anything about the running of prisons. And I survived largely. Totally. I survived totally because I was good at rugby. And they said, one of the physical education instructors said, "Oh, you played at university, didn't you?" And I went, "Yeah." He said, "Would you play for the prison team at the weekend?" And they were playing RAF Northolt. And of course, so I got chosen. I didn't get put immediately into the team. I had to be the replacement, the reserve, the substitute. And somebody got injured, I came on, and I scored 2 tries. And from then on, my life at Wormwood Scrubs was much easier because they would go, "Oh yeah, he plays rugby, he's a really good guy, he's a nice guy. Yeah, he doesn't know anything, but tell him." And so very kindly, a number of older, more experienced prison officers, senior officers, principal officers, less so the chief officers, but they would kind of take me aside and explain what I had to do and how I had to do it. And the danger was often that that might socialize me into behaviors that I didn't want to have. And so I had to also be very aware that I wasn't simply seduced by what they were telling me to do, but stick with the kinds of principles that I felt that I had that had made me want to join the prison service in the first place.
Why did you want to join the prison service?
I wanted to change the prison service because I felt it wasn't running properly. I didn't think it was public service that was really delivering on what it should deliver, which was about keeping people in custody, but also using the opportunity of them being in custody to try and affect some kind of change so that when they were released back into the community, they wouldn't commit further offences. You know, to this day, don't get me going. To this day, you know, the average reading age of the sentenced male prison population of this country is 7. They're functionally illiterate. And therefore, if you begin to just take that one simple fact, then you can begin to see why we should be investing in education. And if we don't invest in education in the community, we have an opportunity to help prisoners learn how to read and write. If they can read and write, then that gives them the opportunity to do everything from reading a bedtime story to their kids to applying for a job. You know, there are some obvious things that one can say that should be being done differently.
Wormwood Scrubs, what sort of prisoners were there? Like, who were the inmates at the time you began working there?
One of the prisoners I would encounter very quickly when I was at Wormwood Scrubs was a serial murderer by the name of Dennis Nilsen. And Nilsen retained, until his death, a kind of correspondence with me, sometimes long philosophical discussions. And then after I moved to other prisons, he would write letters to me. And so I had quite a few of his letters, manuscripts, and so forth. So I learned a great deal about serial murder from a serial killer. And the thing I learned most of all was that you could never trust anything a serial killer tells you. And that was quite an important insight, because at the time, there was certainly a vogue established by the FBI, and they said that you could understand the phenomenon of serial murder through entering the mind of the serial killer. And even at the time, I remember thinking, well, that's not my experience. That's not my experience, not just by interviewing a serial killer for an hour or two, but that's my experience of interviewing this guy repeatedly over a long period of time, and then him corresponding with me. And I thought, what he tells you is a load of rubbish. So why would I begin to believe that you understand the phenomenon of serial murder from entering the mind of a serial killer? But you know, can I tell you this? To this day, I can never move people away from thinking that's the best way that we will gain an insight into serial murder. I cannot shift that paradigm, because that paradigm has become iconic.
So Dennis Nilsen, in your time working in prisons, was he the first serial killer that you had a relationship with, in the sense that you were able to interview and kind of get more of an insight into him as a person?
Dennis Nilsen was not just the first serial killer I interviewed. I think he was the first murderer I interviewed. Most of the serial murderers that I have met, with the exception of Dennis Nilsen, didn't talk about why they killed. I've described them as silent and uncommunicative. They're not people that one encounters in Hollywood movies who are desperate to tell Clarice what they might have been doing. Do you still hear the silence of the lambs, Clarice? You know, they're not like that. They don't talk about things. They're very silent and uncommunicative, and they don't want to discuss with you what it is they might have done. And Nilsen was therefore really unusual because he was so loquacious, so talkative, and he talked endlessly. Dennis Nilsen never shut up. And it wasn't like having a conversation with him. It was almost as if I simply happened to be a living human being he could direct a soliloquy at. And so even then, even though he was talking constantly about what he did, I never felt to any great purpose.
And what did he tell you about the crimes he committed? What were those conversations that you had like?
Well, those conversations with him were about him killing for company. He killed because he didn't like to let the young men go in the morning. He killed for company because he was lonely. Now, that seems really persuasive, but that's rubbish, really, isn't it? He didn't kill for company because he chose very carefully which young men he was going to kill and which young men he might have been sleeping with he was going to allow to live, because he allowed to live those young men whom he knew would be missed in the morning, whom he knew had people that would go, so-and-so hasn't come back last night. Where is he? They would report that person missing to the police. So he was very consciously allowing some people to go free whilst others would be murdered. And of course, there's where homophobia comes in. A number of the young men that either escaped or were let go by him went to the police and reported what had happened to them. And one young man said that when he reported Nilsen, they went round to Nilsen's house and a flat, I beg your pardon, and he said, oh, it was a lover's tiff. And he said, as soon as Nilsen implied that we had been having a sexual relationship, the police didn't want to know. And there's a direct example of how homophobia makes gay men vulnerable to attack.
And why do you think Dennis Nilsen was an exception compared to other serial killers that you've met, in that he was very willing to talk about his crimes?
Dennis Nilsen just liked to dominate. Dennis Nilsen found a way, and the reason he committed murder was a form of domination. And talking about his crimes allowed him to continue to dominate conversation. It was a way that he could still be relevant, still interesting to people who didn't know much about his story. So it was a way of just maintaining a person, an image, a brand for people as the decades progressed.
How did you go from Wormwood Scrubs prisons to becoming a full-time criminologist and working to interview other serial killers?
So from Wormwood Scrubs, I wasn't at Wormwood Scrubs for that long. And ultimately, the places that cement the career that I've got were a place called HMP Grendon, which it works as the only prison that operates entirely as a therapeutic community in England and Wales. And therefore, prisoners are in therapy at Grendon. And a lot of people that go to Grendon will have used lethal violence, committed murder, sometimes multiple times. So they were in therapy, and I would learn a lot from them in therapy about why they behaved as they had behaved, according to them. And then after I had worked at Grendon, I was asked to help to design and manage the 2 units at HMP Wood Hill in Milton Keynes, which housed the 12 most violent prisoners in the country. So that again exposes me to people who used lethal violence or committed multiple sexual offences. And so those experiences were the ones that begin to create the kind of applied criminology that I then subsequently, after I left the prison service, would use academically and in other applied ways. As a criminologist who might be advising on a live investigation, what would I do? Now, I would prefer if somebody else did the interviewing, because I think if I do the interviewing, there are added elements to it which aren't necessarily helpful in trying to establish what it is that we're seeking to establish. So often what I would be doing is listening to the interview and then reading the transcript and then suggesting interviewing strategies that the interviewing officer or officers might like to adapt and use. I was asked to read a transcript of an interview by a police force, and the suspect was an avid reader. And the police officer asked, "Oh, do you have a favorite book?" And the suspect said, "Oh no, that's a silly question, a stupid question. There's no such thing as a favorite book." And then apropos of nothing, he just said, "Oh, but my favorite is, the book I liked this year was," and then he named a book. And then the interview just continued. And so I thought, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Well, what was in that book? I'd never heard of that book. And so as part of the report that I eventually wrote, I had read the book and realized what that book was about, and could speak to the senior investigating officer to say, look, this book is going to reveal something in terms of what we're interested in. And there was an example which I often call psychological leakage. There was an example of like a Freudian slip that, they tell you something subconsciously about what they've done without acknowledging what it is that they've done. And often I'm looking for those kinds of things.
What do you think is more important to look at rather than trying to enter the mind of a serial killer? Where do you focus?
So rather than concentrate on the killer, if you look at the victim groups, which groups, by and large, are predated Who gets murdered by serial killers? In this country, by and large, only 5 groups of people get targeted by serial killers. And women or girls dominate 4 out of those 5 groups. The only group of men that gets overwhelmingly targeted by serial killers are gay men, and the two groups of women or girls that are targeted by serial killers in our country are women over the age of 60 and sex workers. So even if you just take those simple realities, you can reduce the incidence of serial murder by targeting the circumstances that make those groups vulnerable to attack. So, for example, with gay men, they are made vulnerable by homophobia. With sex workers, how we police young women who sell sexual services, often because they're addicted to Class A drugs, creates a vulnerability that serial killers can exploit. And with the group that's most regularly targeted, women over the age of 60, you try and work out their vulnerability is created by living in a culture that's obsessed with youth. You know, we silence older people in our culture. We don't give them a voice. They're not seen as important. And because they're not seen as important, if they die unexpectedly, that's not questioned. And of course, our most prolific serial killer is Harold Shipman. You know, killed 215, perhaps as many as 260 of his largely female patients, most of whom were over the age of 60. But it is about the vulnerability. Serial killers are very good at exploiting the rubbing points in our culture. And again, one of the things I've said of late, I think a rubbing point in our culture that will be exploited by serial killers at the moment are the numbers of homeless people that we have. And if you look at the figures related to the deaths of homeless people in the United Kingdom, they are incredibly high. And we tend not to comment on that because we think, oh, they're homeless, they had mental health problems, they had addiction problems. We tend not to question the numbers of homeless people who are dying. And I think that rubbing point would be exploited by somebody who wanted to be a serial killer. I think it's really interesting that our most recent British male serial killer is Stephen Port. And Stephen Port is a gay man who targeted other gay men using a gay dating app. And if you think about the police investigation into the young men who died, that police investigation was appalling and rightly, roundly criticised. The Metropolitan Police failed. And, you know, the irony is, of course, 2 of the bodies of the young men that Stephen Port murdered were found in exactly the same place by the same dog walker who kept saying, you know, look, I found another dead body. So our most recent male serial killer is still using homophobia as a way to get away with serial murder. And our most recent female serial killer, controversially, is Lucy Letby, who would target another vulnerable group, which are babies and infants, and which is one of the 5 groups. And often it's female babies and infants that get murdered by serial murderers. For me, it's interesting that our 2 most recent serial killers, whether you think Lucy Letby's innocent or guilty, she's been convicted of murdering a number of babies. Our most recent female and male serial killers are still targeting the groups I identified that were vulnerable to attack way back 20, 25 years ago.
And when it comes to serial killers who have positions of power like doctors or nurses, why do you think that people in these positions of power, especially when it comes to medical fields, you know, Harold Shipman, Lucy Letby, why do they end up killing?
So you're back into the medical psychological model because you want to know the motivation question. People love the motivation question. Why did they do it? You know, you don't need to know motivation in terms, prosecution in a murder case doesn't have to demonstrate what the motive was. They just have to demonstrate that the facts beyond reasonable doubt point to the reality. The accused person deliberately set out to kill their victims. We don't really bother about the motivation. Of all the serial murderers or mass murderers that I've had to work with or interview or research, they are so often looking to live a life less ordinary. They believe that they deserve more than they have. And one of the ways of living that life less ordinary is to be notorious, to be infamous. And often that involves them exercising power and control. And that power and control they feel they deserve, but is missing in other aspects of their lives. Now, with some of the others, I can say that, and yet each of those murderers will have an added ingredient that's unique to them. It might be sexual, it might be fetishistic, it might be something else that informs their signature in terms of why they're doing what they're doing. But usually it comes down to they like power and control. They like the ultimate power of control, which is demonstrated by the fact that they take another person's life.
And a focus of your work has been murder in the UK.
Yeah.
How do you feel that we as a society deal with murder, and how are we doing that in measure to other countries?
Well, I think murder as a crime is very poorly understood, not just in the United Kingdom, but throughout the world. And that's largely because people get their information from news media or from drama. And news media and drama would tend to tell the story of murder in a particular way. I often talk about the clear-up rate for murder and would say to audiences, what percentage of murders do the police make a charge against somebody for the crime of murder / manslaughter? How often do you think there is a conviction, a charge, and then a conviction for these crimes? And people will always guess below 50%, below 20%. And the answer, of course, is 90%. 9 out of 10 murders are solved. And that is quite shocking for people when you tell them. I sometimes say, where are you most likely to be murdered in the United Kingdom? I'm so keen to ask you, where do you think you're most likely to be murdered?
I would say at home.
Which is, thankfully, you have read my book. And so, of course, you are more likely to be murdered. Whether you're a man or a woman, you're more likely to be murdered in your home. And the particular room that you're most likely to be murdered in at home is the kitchen. And you're most likely to be murdered in the kitchen for the simple instrumental reasons that we spend most of our lives at home in the kitchen. And the kitchen happens to be the place where there's a knife. I then talk about, which most people will know, 9 out of 10 perpetrators of murder will be men. And then I go, which usually people are less aware of, that 7 out of 10 murder victims are also men. And so this is really a male phenomenon, albeit too many women, 2 women a week, die at the hands of their partners or ex-partners. And so there's still a great deal of misogyny driving lethal violence against women, or indeed just violence against women. Murder is a male phenomenon, but you don't tend to get that presented to you in news media or in drama. There's much more drama in presenting a stranger perpetrated murder, which might take place in some kind of unlit alleyway, as opposed to the reality. Murder is often committed by somebody that is known to the victim in the home.
And how often in your experience are people that commit murder or serial murder psychopaths?
There definitely is a significant number of the people that I would encounter who've used lethal violence who would score highly on Hare's psychopathy checklist revised. There is definitely a correlation between scoring highly and the kinds of crimes that they would commit. But that doesn't mean to say all of them are, and it doesn't mean to say that everybody who would score highly on Hare's psychopathy checklist revised would use violence or lethal violence. There are functioning psychopaths, people who might be risk-taking and so forth. If you went through all the kinds of things that would characterize a psychopath, you might get somebody who is functioning, who would have all of those personality traits, but they wouldn't necessarily commit crime. They just wouldn't be very pleasant to work with or to know or to be married to. But yeah, there's a significant proportion of the people that I will encounter that I'm mentally, when I meet them, when I'm mentally going through, oh yeah, oh my gosh, this person would score, and then I start totting up what they're saying to me and thinking, there's something here. But listen, one of my best friends is clinically a psychopath, and I've known him for years. I have an empathy for him. He might not have an empathy for me. My favorite story is that he was a prolific bank robber. He did use violence, or the threat of violence, but he was actually a prolific bank robber. And at one stage, he was the most prolific bank robber in the United Kingdom. And he committed scores of bank robberies. And I did say to him once, I said, well, what did you do with the money? There was so much money. I said, well, what did you do? And of course, risk takers, easy come, easy go. He would have all this money, and he said, oh, I did stupid things with the money. And I said, well, what stupid things? He said, oh, I bought cars. He said, at one stage, outside my house were, I can't remember the exact number, 12 high-end, top-of-the-range cars. And I said, well, why is that stupid? They said, oh, I can't drive. And you're like, oh, it's just something stupid that he did with the money, because the money didn't mean anything to him. It was the risks that he was taking to get the money that meant something to him, and the power that he felt when he was in the moment of robbing the bank that was important to him.
Looking back on your career so far, what is it that you are most proud of?
I got an award recently called a Lifetime Achievement Award. And it kind of made me think, that probably means I'm going to die soon, doesn't it? And I did try and think, well, what has been the achievement? My attempt has been throughout my career, both applied theoretically and through my research and writing, to try and get people to talk about victims, not to talk about the killers, not to idolize the killers and make them aspirational characters, but to instead concentrate on victims and those victim groups who by and large are targeted in our culture. And I think even if I've been a voice in the wind, howling at the moon, I have stuck resolutely to that, and I've stuck resolutely to that because of those first days at Wormwood Scrubs when I'm encountering people like Dennis Nilsen, and I'm thinking, why do we care what might be motivating him? Let's talk about the fact he was able to kill all these young men because they were homeless, some of whom were gay, and because the police didn't investigate that properly. And I suppose that's been the thing that's characterized all of my professional career.
This was someone who was stalking Claire, was fixated and obsessed with her and intrusive in her life, and would not take no for an answer. And she was terrified. And at 20 to 8, when Claire's looking at one of her colleagues, She worked on a cosmetic counter and she's looking at the time and saying, we're almost done. He comes up behind her, shoots her once in the back of the head, 3 times in the face.